I mean, we have seen some what we consider to be unlawful and underhanded tactics employed by the RCMP against not just demonstrators, but against private property. And of course, I'm now talking about the excavators that were essentially sabotaged by the RCMP. We say without any kind of a lawful precedent for the same, and we're investigating that and maybe filing civil actions for the owners of those excavators. We're still in the process of looking into that matter. But we have seen the RCMP not necessarily playing with a full deck of cards in their dealings with the demonstrators. So when we see serious allegations come down from the RCMP in efforts to break up this blockade, it's natural for Criminal and Regulatory Defense Counsel to be suspicious of the allegations that are made by the RCMP.
Kian K2 Simone here for Rebel News, and I'm joined with Chad Williamson of Williamson Law, and we spent some time together in Coutts, Alberta, where for the better part of 2 weeks, truckers were blocking the border on and off over the period of time in protest of the mandates countrywide. So you came into the scene about 4 days in, if I think I got that correct there. You were hired for counsel by Rebel News at truckerlawyer.ca, where we're crowdfunding the truckers' legal defense. And at the end there, it sort of ended abruptly, where there were some arrests a few blocks away from where the truckers were held up. So you and your office were retained to deal with the criminal and regulatory charges. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So we came down about 4 days into the blockade, and myself and my colleague Martin Raymond were essentially embedded for 2 weeks, first together and then on and off in shifts with the demonstrators down at the blockade, assisting with negotiations, providing summary legal advice to people who may have been charged with regulatory or criminal offenses relating to their involvement in the blockade. What ensued after was somewhat nebulous, and we're still getting all of the information in. There were a series of very serious charges levied against a couple of individuals, and then there were almost close to a dozen additional serious criminal charges, less serious than some of the bigger charges, but there were at least over a dozen people who have been charged with criminal offenses. Now, we acted and kind of sprang into action to assist these folks to negotiate bail and consensual releases with the Crown Prosecution Service. And I'm happy to report that my other colleague, Yoav Niv, has been acting as senior counsel on the criminal and regulatory defenses that we're providing to a number of the individuals that have been issued charges in relations to mischief, blocking the highway, and then the more serious charges. There were some conspiracy charges, which obviously have affected just a handful of individuals, but also some unlawful possession of firearms charges relating to the alleged cache of weapons that the RCMP say that they found on a property that was near the site. We have negotiated the release, at least the interim release, of most of the individuals that have what we call the medium charges, which are the mischief and the unlawful possession of firearms charges. We are in the process of negotiating release for some of the other individuals, some of which who have now are in the process of retaining their own lawyers because of some ethical obligations that we needed to take into consideration. But we have been there essentially from day one to assist them throughout this process. And I suppose the criminal charges and the regulatory infractions that have come down, and we expect more to follow. We expect a bunch of tickets. Investigations, it's my understanding, are still ongoing, and we will be with these truckers right until the end.
Well, I think you brought up an important part there, just at the very start, that the details are still coming in. This is still a developing story. So the narrative out now is that they were violent and they were planning on doing something, but we don't know all the facts just yet.
I mean, we have seen some what we consider to be unlawful and underhanded tactics employed by the RCMP against not just demonstrators, but against private property. And of course, I'm now talking about the excavators that were essentially sabotaged by the RCMP. We say without any kind of a lawful precedent for the same, and we're investigating that and maybe filing civil actions for the owners of those excavators. We're still in the process of looking into that matter. But we have seen the RCMP not necessarily playing with a full deck of cards in their dealings with the demonstrators. So when we see serious allegations come down from the RCMP in efforts to break up this blockade, it's natural for criminal and regulatory defense counsel to be suspicious of the allegations that are made by the RCMP. And at this point, we don't actually have a lot of evidence upon which to draw any kind of conclusion as to the guilt of these individuals. And in our country and in a free democracy, the presumption of innocence is paramount. And we take the position that these folks are innocent until proven guilty. And the facts will inevitably come out as they slowly do in these types of cases. Now, turning to the Emergency Measures Act, it's clear by essentially the disbanding of the Coutts blockade, through the use of regular charges that are already on the books in the criminal code and through various other pieces of legislation, that the emergency measures powers that were implemented by the federal government and by Justin Trudeau are absolutely unnecessary. The last time, obviously, that we saw these types of powers being used was during the FLQ crisis in Quebec, almost 50 years ago, when we actually had armed suspects kidnapping and going after people. And that's really serious. And even back then, people were questioning the use of those powers because, of course, that type of behavior is unlawful on the face of it, even without this type of heavy-handed approach used by the federal government. Now, to clear peaceful protesters out in Ottawa, I realize that, obviously there's been some inconvenience for the last 2 weeks to some of the folks that live in Ottawa. Frankly, the country has been in a state of economic wreckage and severe inconvenience as a result of what we consider to be unlawful and unconstitutional COVID mandates that have been imposed upon the citizenry of Canada for the last 2 years, without, might I add, a lot of recourse in the courts. Every time that we have tried to challenge the constitutionality and the lawfulness of a lot of the public health measures, we have basically been put on ice, not just by the government, but by the very judiciary itself. So we are seeing people essentially frozen without a recourse through due process and the administration of justice, and without access to justice and legal means to challenge the very laws that are affecting them so negatively and so seriously and are frankly destroying businesses, destroying families. There's talk of suicides as a result of the mental anguish that a lot of people have suffered stemming from some of the COVID stuff. The emergency measures that have been brought into place, we believe that the threshold it hasn't even been close to having been met. We think that it's unlawful. It's my understanding that there are already challenges happening out in Ontario challenging the lawfulness of the implementation of these measures. But frankly, this is ridiculous. It's a very dark time in Canadian history. And what we think is even more concerning is this could serve as a blueprint for future actions by governments when they simply don't like what people have to say when they're criticized. This may be a blueprint for other Western democracies, and I hate to almost put air quotes around that, but when Parliament doesn't even meet, when you're giving the government the authority to essentially have banks act on their behalf to, without due process, freeze bank accounts of regular Canadians, I don't know if it can be called a democracy anymore. And the Western world has a number of governments that are following down these same footsteps. This must be concerning for people who live in the States, who oppose their government and who have a constitutional right to oppose their government. Australia, New Zealand, some of the Western European countries as well. This is a very, very concerning time for anyone that lives in what we used to call democratic nations.
Well, you answered my final question there just at the start about the RCMP sabotaging those excavators. And I was going to lead that into like just the way that they were acting they're not playing fair. And that was before the Emergency Act. So just imagine what's happening in Ottawa after the Emergency Act of the comparison between Coutts and Ottawa. I want to thank you again for that update. For anybody out there who's watching, you can help these truckers. Chad, you and your law firm are fighting tooth and nail for these guys to get the truth out there, to get the details out there, and to just help them in court. Even though the Coutts border blockade is now over with, the truckers still need your help in court. If you go to truckerlawyer.ca, you can help crowdfund their legal defense, where Chad Williamson here is going to be fighting tooth and nail for these guys in court.